Welcome, everyone, to another edition of 45 Forward, where our mission is to help you, our listeners from Los Angeles to Long Island, make your second half of life even better than the first. Today's episode is the final chapter of a three-part conversation that I began earlier this summer, focusing on a terrific book, What Went Right, Lessons from Both Sides of the Teacher's Desk, by co-authors Roberta Israeloff and George McDermott. Roberta was one of my classmates at Syosset High School on Long Island in the late 1960s and has remained a longtime friend. George was our 11th grade American Lit teacher at Syosset. Roberta, a career writer and author, is currently the director of the nonprofit Squire Family Foundation, dedicated to encouraging the teaching of philosophy at pre-college levels. And George, a writer and poet, has had several teaching jobs, as well as extensive editorial experience in several business and media fields over several decades. In my last conversation with Roberta and George in July, we elaborated on some of their recollections and perspectives during their earlier teaching experiences, which were detailed in their book. We went on to focus on what's changed, or not, in public education, society, and in their own lives, inside and outside the classroom. In today's episode, we'll continue our discussion of significant shifts and trends in public education that George and Roberta have observed, some of which have spurred considerable debate, such as the application of more corporate approaches to education and questions about how much education should be linked to the training of students more specifically for future jobs. We'll take a longer look at the true meaning of lifelong learning. And finally, I'll ask Roberta and George to offer some parting takeaways from their collaborative exploration of education over life, what they discovered about themselves in the process, and how we can all continue this conversation and ultimately teach us how to be more human. So now I'm delighted to welcome again both Roberta Israeloff and George McDermott. Roberta and George, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ron.
Great to see you guys again. So as I mentioned in the intro, what I'd like to do is just sort of widen the lens a little bit today, talking about how education has changed or not over the years, and talk about specifically what you and you both of us you have had in our previous conversations offline, just about the focus today. It seems so there's a hardening focus on data and analysis and performance evaluation that sort of is oriented toward a business approach. And it certainly has had some impact on education, and certainly in public education, because, and kind of analogous to my own profession of, media, where everybody sees the media and thinks they know about it. Everybody thinks they know about public education. So I just wanted to give you guys ask you what your thoughts are these days about, this, corporatization trend and what the impact has been. So let me start with you, George, a little bit, and then Roberta, you dive in with.
The corporate influence on public education is probably the most pernicious influence around these days. I currently live not on Long Island any longer. I now live in Florida, and Florida is the center of the privatization, corporatization of public education. For it may be for the entire country. It's certainly one of the most. And there are finally, I'm seeing some resistance on the part of ordinary citizens, parents, and others to the constant encroachment on the public sector of the private sector. And but we still have an awful lot of charter schools. We still have vouchers that can be used at private schools. We still have private schools that are sucking out big chunks of the funding that should be going to the public schools, and that's scary.
Roberta, your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a kind of continuation of what seems to be happening more generally, which is that we form silos. Public education was the way that you met people who your family didn't know, who weren't in your immediate circle. It was kind of an engine of democracy in that way. Even in Syosset, which was a pretty homogeneous community, we still met people, children, fellow students from different walks of life, different teachers from different backgrounds. When I walk into a public school, a private school now for my work, it's very disorienting because it's just a slice of the elite. They all say they have scholarship students there, but it still seems like it's promoting this idea that we're separate and there are class and racial distinctions, and that doesn't seem to be what education should be doing for us.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I mean, and going back to what you were saying, George, in addition to drawing away resources, it seems to me that there's an issue about, the way you measure performance in business, which is not necessarily analogous to education, and the things you're trying to teach aren't necessarily measurable in the same ways.
I don't think I don't think education can be measured in the short term.
Hmm.
I think education is by definition a long-term process, and if you want to discover whether student X is successfully educated, you're going to have to wait until student X has died, probably. Say, okay, how did they do, in their life? The problem is it's almost like a CPA approach to education. They're talking about accountability. They're talking about performance. They're talking about measurable data points. They're talking about objective measure certifications. They're talking about, and those things have very little, if any, relevance to education.
Hmm.
It's and in fact very little relevance to the students' real lives, because when you try to get objective data points, what you wind up with is standardized testing. You wind up with measurable, quantitative stuff, and and what you're going to wind up needing as a student, as a graduate, is much more qualitative.
Yeah, I think the whole point, excuse me, the whole point of our book is that what survived for us is not the quantitative part, but the quality of the education we had, which is not measurable. It's not quantifiable in the way that we understand, metrics, because you never know when something that you talked about or an exchange you had in 10th grade or even second grade will come back to you or contributed to the person that you've become. I think every teacher has received letters, or if anyone still writes letters, emails, whatever, late in years after they were in a classroom together. That's certainly what happened to us, to say, your class really had an impact on me. It took a number of decades for us to get back together to say that. So how do you measure that? How does that how can you put that in a package? I think it's part of the I think it's part of the impulse toward let's be quick and easy. And I was at a work conference this past weekend, and a wonderful social studies teacher who's a colleague of mine said at the beginning of her presentation, my goal for my students, my task is to make things more complicated for them. And I thought that was absolutely what a teacher's job is.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that, to me, a lot of what seems to be driving things, at least in my mind, is the this sense of fear, and so I kind of try to figure out what are people so afraid of it? And in an odd way, it seems to be almost an extension of what in our generation, Roberta, is known as helicopter parenting, where parents have been just afraid to let go of their kids, to let them explore, to let them make mistakes, to let them, establish their own opinions. And it seems like this is, basically, you know, seeped into the, the nature of education, where they're, there's parents or politicians are trying to control everything, and you can't do that. That's not really what the purpose is of education. I think you guys said several points. It's to leave, students with questions, not answers.
Well, the thing that you mentioned about helicopter parenting and protecting and the old Paul Simon song, "The Boy in the Bubble," and that sort of thing. The problem with that, of course, in the long run, is that the people who are protected don't learn how to deal with anything that's beyond that experience. You're in the bubble, if you don't know how to deal with the stuff that's outside the bubble.
Mm-hmm.
There is biomedical research going on right now that's showing that children who are protected from outside environment wind up having less robust immunological systems.
Mm-hmm.
And people who have been protected during their entire lives from the infections are the ones, there is a theory at least, that they're the ones who are having the most trouble with the COVID pandemic.
Right.
And that's analogous to what goes on with education. If I were a parent who wanted to make sure that my children stayed with the beliefs that I was trying to instill in them at home for the rest of their lives, I would want to make sure they were exposed to other people's competing beliefs, because I'd want them to be able to defend their own systems against those other systems.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it's a good idea to keep people isolated from each other.
Yeah, I totally agree, George. I think that and now more than ever, when we have a society that is increasingly diverse, a world that's increasingly diverse and complicated, and requires people to really cross over lots of different borders to understand the world. And we're basically, I think isolation is a real killer. I don't mean that always literally, but intellectually, and culturally. I think that's that exacerbates divisiveness. And so, teaching our students, how to deal with these issues, I think is really important.
But we're talking about the new phenomenon of trigger warnings, which never existed. I don't remember them existing. There were no warnings that said we're going to be talking about difficult material. It seems, but faced with this situation now, I think it just highlights how much things have changed and how out of it we are, because I listen to young people talk about why they want them and why they're necessary to them. To us, it seems to speak to a fragility and to me of a fearfulness. But I've heard people speak very passionately about them, and it just makes me feel farther and farther away from what's happening currently. So I'm not sure how I come down on that issue, frankly. I'm trying to be open to other points of view.
I don't know either. I have a friend who is a novelist, and he says, my whole reason for being, the whole reason for my novels is to trigger people. I mean, that's the point, is to trigger them so that they can figure out how to deal with what's being triggered. And so I don't know.
Yeah, well, I don't have the answer either, but I do think we need to take that risk. I think that, growth in life, whether it's literal or intellectual or cultural, requires some risk. You have to let go of the control. And I think that's, to me, this fearfulness about loss of control. It's like, it's okay if you're, your kids, if you care about your kids and you love them and you trust in them and you trust their capacity. I guess part of it, you need to trust the system too. I guess the part of it is the lack of trust in organizations and institutions in general, which is a problem, and certainly there are problems, but I think, you have to be willing to take some risks. And I think one of them is to let education be education. Um, we're going to come up with a break soon, but I just wanted to start at least a discussion about. So along these lines, there is this issue about control and accountability. So that it's a little bit of the, uh, about the corporate notion too. But and you guys know that one of the issues has come up is just people coming out of the educational system and then there are no jobs for them. And so this concern about, well, I guess it came out of Florida, George, this notion of, we need more engineers, not philosophers, that political notion. And I think that's something which I have an issue with. I want to get your thoughts on that. But we're going to just hold on to that though. And we're going to come back to this right after the break. So folks, don't go anywhere. We'll be coming right back with much more from Roberta Israeloff and George McDermott on what went right and not so right in education. Welcome back to 45 Forward, folks, where we're talking with George McDermott and Roberta Israeloff, the co-authors of What Went Right. Before we continue, I wanted to let you know that you can learn more about Roberta and George and listen to my previous two shows with them. The first one was on June 13th and the second on July 18th. You can go to my website and listen to them, or go to the voiceamerica.com site and click on 45 Forward there. So before the break, we were talking about the issue of training versus education. And I know that, part of this, I think, is just because I think a lot of students, for various reasons, are coming out of school and college in particular with huge student debt, and there's no sense of jobs. But I think that conflates, some of the issues sometimes about, well, what education should be doing. So I wanted to ask each of you, about, well, what is the role of education, public education specifically, for training people for their future in the workplace? Let me start with you, Roberta, this time.
Well, that's a tough one, because I am more aware than ever that I come from a place of great advantage, and my family, from my grandparents on, my grandparents never went to high school. I think one of my grandmothers just got as far as sixth grade, and she had a beautiful handwriting. So, to us, and growing up in the 50s and 60s, there were very different expectations. My husband and I often talk about the fact that when we graduated, we felt as if, well, we have had such a great education. We can basically pursue a career, any career. We can try on a couple. We can use our best talents. I think the climate is very different today. You are at a disadvantage if your basic skills are not up to par, and many students have that problem: math and simple reading and writing. I think that has to be a given for everybody. And then once that's established, then the goal is to push you, as we were talking about, into a place where you can encounter new ideas and kind of stretch your mind. That seems to me what the goal of education is, as I said before, to make things more complicated, to see that you have to get out of your own perspective sometimes and see things through other eyes. Right. I really think that's the goal. And I think a lot of students are feeling that they're not prepared to do that.
George, I know that you've talked before about, the need for flexibility, between high school and college, and just to think about, whether or not things should be like this lockstep, funnel to college. So talk about that a bit.
Growing convictions, in fact, is that I don't think college is necessarily used for the right things by everyone. I don't
Mhm.
think college is necessarily something that every student should pursue. Um, I think there are things you can learn in college that you can't learn anywhere else. I think that's true.
Mhm.
And and if what you want to learn is what you learn in college, then I think you should go to college. But I don't think you should be going to college because it will help you get a better job. Um, I know electricians, I know machinists, I know plumbers, I know other people who do not have college degrees who are actually making a much better living than I ever did
Mm.
with my education.
Mhm.
Um, so so I it's not a job thing. It's a I mean it might help you discover what you want to do in your life, in which case maybe that's the reason you should go to college. If uh, or you might know what you want to do in life, and that might be require going to college. I mean, if you want to be a lawyer, you have to go to college. If you want to be a physician, you have to go to college. If you want to be an accountant, I guess you have to go to college. But not if you want to do any number of other things.
Mhm.
And and actually, once you've gone to college, you don't have to do the things uh, that college prepares you to do.
Right.
I was just reading an interesting story about a woman, recent graduate. I think graduate degrees, who became a barista, and it was mainly because she wanted to do the labor organizing
Mhm.
for the
Mm.
baristas of America.
Right.
So
Yeah. 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 There seems to be, when in our previous conversation, we talked about is there a basic canon that should come out of education in terms of what the basic canon of knowledge. And, I think that there are differences about what that canon is. I do think that's true, but one of it is a skills canon, which is I think that no matter what profession, I think there is a place for, you know, basic math and even more so basic communication and writing skills. I mean, I've talked to engineers who come out, and certainly they they benefited from higher education in engineering. There are certain very technical skills they had, but one of the difficulties they had when they got their jobs was writing reports. They had poor communication skills, and it just never occurred to them that how much of their job involved communicating their ideas to others. So I think that's a very important part of education, that it's just there are basic skills that I think we really should focus on. And as you said, George, let their interests be developed on their own. Um, and then, I, I do have, a little bit too of the sense of, from a trade perspective, yeah, I agree with you that that there are, plumbers and electricians and so forth that, that do quite well learning trades. And I do sort of feel that there should be a little bit of that more as part of basic education. For me to come out, and you know we focus on so much about giving people opportunities as homeowners, first time homeowners, right? And one of the problems is that, yeah, you can buy a home, but can you take care of it? You I mean, there's certain basic things that people just don't know, including me. I mean, to me these days, it's even complicated trying to change a light bulb, because there's so many different light bulbs and so many different sockets and so many different, circuits, that so there, it seems to be that we I have no problem with focusing on higher education, but I do think that we need to swing a little bit from where we were, because certainly when Roberta and I were going to high school, certainly the measurement of the success of our class was, okay, how many of you went to college? And that may not be the right measurement. So um anyway, and I think that, there is, I think that I remember, um you know um listening to you, Roberta, talk about your experience walking up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan and going around City College, and just seeing, I did some work at City College myself, my post journalism career. And, I do think that, there is something about, as you mentioned, education giving people an opportunity to learn and to be with people who are not like you, and I think um, that's one of the great things about public education.
It is. And, kind of piggybacking on George's experience of being a teacher in the 60s and then coming back years later, I went for the first 3 semesters of college to a state university and then transferred mostly for personal reasons to one of the 7 sisters. And in all honesty, I had a much better experience at the state university. Um, I, it was a much more diverse crowd, and the teachers were different as well. They were not as snobby, they were not as elitist. I had a very hard time at the elite college that I went to, and interestingly, I really don't have any friends from that time of my life, whereas I still have friends that I met at the state university. So I don't think there's a single a single category. I've talked to electricians and plumbers who come to our house to fix things because we can't do anything either
Hmm.
for ourselves, including changing light bulbs, who I felt I connected with on some level of understanding of the world, a kind of more encompassing vision and understanding of people and openness to conversation. Um, so there's a quality that I look for anyway. I don't know, maybe not everybody. I mean, not everybody does everything, but it's important to me. This kind of humanistic vision, which is the most important thing that I got out of my schooling from basically first grade on, um, and 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 that's kind of what counts to me more than where you apply it. As George said, there are people with degrees who go into making coffee or doing other things, and they find their own path. But I think it's part of the if we instill in young kids and lifelong learners this idea that that, as George said, that education is a long journey. It's not a period of years. It's an openness to learning throughout the
Yeah,
course of your life.
yeah, yeah.
And
George,
some people welcome that and some people don't.
right. But George, pick up on that, because we were talking about a little bit about lifelong learning, and you've said before there is no end to education. And so, what should be the role of, as we, we segue out of formal education? How should we, keep this process going?
It's it's a matter of resisting the urge to be comfortable
Hmm.
with what you are, who you are, where you are, what you're doing. Um, there are, as I said, I live in Florida now, and there are an awful lot of retired people in
Hmm.
Florida, and an awful lot of the retired people in Florida fall into patterns that they never venture out of.
Hmm.
And I think it's very important to force yourself to venture out of the patterns, to venture out of what's familiar, to expose yourself to situations in which you will deliberately make yourself feel uncomfortable.
Hmm.
And that's one of the stimuli, one of the most effective stimuli for learning is figuring out how to deal with something that's different from your experience, how to figure out how to deal with something that makes you feel uncomfortable, how to become comfortable with the uncomfortable.
Hmm. Right, right.
I think there's a different paradigm today, though, because my younger colleagues speak very much. I agree with you, George, but my younger colleagues speak very sincerely about that the only way you can be open to learning is when you're comfortable, when you feel safe. They stress the idea of feeling safe. That's where trigger warnings come in. They don't want to feel jostled. They don't want to feel threatened. They're very concerned with their personal safety. And they say that if someone comes on, starts talking or presents material that's upsetting, they shut off. So as I say, it seems like a paradigm shift that we're just aged out of, and it's disorienting for me. But I hear that quite frequently.
Yeah. Well, I hear what you're saying, Roberta, and I guess my feeling is that you're both right in this sense that you need to be in a safe environment that you trust in order to take risks. Okay. And so if you feel generally unsafe, you're right, it's going to be difficult to take risks and be uncomfortable. But if there's a basic feeling of comfort and safety, that you're in a trusting environment, then in order to grow and then in order to really be vital as you get older, you must take that risk. And there isn't, a growing cadre of research, that in terms of looking at longevity, human longevity, and human health over that period. And one of the factors, and a lot of people are looking at issues with dementia. How do you reduce the risk of dementia as you get older, which is a big worry of a lot of us as human life goes longer and longer. It's like, well, it's great as long as I don't have dementia or Alzheimer's. Um, and one of the things that they discover, of course, is that there are issues of exercise, there are issues of social engagement, and diet and nutrition. But then this other factor is cognitive development, and they have shown that to challenge yourself as you get older, in fact, not only keeps you vital and healthy, it stimulates brain growth. But what does it most is what you talked about, George. Yes, it's doing, puzzles and Sudoku and that, crosswords, but it's in the areas that are most significant and most beneficial is when you're really challenged. You're really out of your comfort zone. You've got to figure out something that's very different, and it could be simple, even in the sense of you always use your right hand, and all of a sudden, like, well, try using your left hand to solve that problem. And that really forces you to think differently about things. So we're going to take another quick break. But don't go away, folks. We have one more vital section left with Roberta and George before we conclude. So don't go anywhere. Welcome back, folks. We're in our last segment with Roberta Israeloff and George McDermott, the co-authors of What Went Right. And before the break, we were talking. We just I wanted to continue a very interesting conversation about the issue of how do we move forward when we're uncomfortable? How do we get people to take risks and yet create an environment where they feel comfortable to do so. So during the break, George was talking about the issue of control, which I'd like him to bring into our last segment before we move on to our final thoughts.
It occurs to me that what people who feel that they need to feel comfortable really feel is that what they feel is they need to feel in command of the situation. They need to be that the threats that they perceive, that the discomforting thoughts that come in, the influences, the trigger messages, are really just things that threaten their command, their mastery of themselves. And if you feel in command of yourself, if you feel as if you've mastered yourself, then you're much better able to deal with the external influences in your life. And
right. Yeah.
So maybe it's a psychiatric problem. I don't know.
Well, I'm not sure. You were about to say something, Roberta, and then I wanted to add something.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think that part of feeling confident in yourself is feeling confident to give yourself over to someone else or a body of knowledge or a book. You know how when you settle in with a book that you really like, you kind of feel like, I'm giving myself over to this author. I'm going to hear what this person is saying. And the same way when you're in a class with a teacher that you really enjoy listening to, it's an admission. I think I mentioned this before, of this philosophical concept of intellectual humility, knowing that we don't know everything, and we learn from all different sources, and you're submitting to there's, I think we talked about in the book, this notion of giving yourself over to something that you don't know and you want to know. And it's not always easy for a lot of people who feel that they want to always be in control. So I think all the things we're talking about involve a balancing of dichotomies. And I guess everyone needs to find their own level of comfort, discomfort, in control, out of control. Maybe it's different phrases for the same idea.
Yeah. But I totally agree with that. Going full circle at the same time to something that you mentioned, Roberta, in the book, and that has to do with the way you felt comfortable in George's class. So, in other words, I do think so. There is a role in the classroom. There's the role of the teacher in creating or helping to create an environment where you do feel safe to do the things you do talk about and to explore. And I remember you talking very specifically about that you did feel that comfort that you could really explore. So I think you set the tone, George, for that. So I think there is that's something that teachers can do. That, as long as you point it, as long as they're allowed to do that. There is a lot of pressure on, well, just cover the curriculum. But I think that that's something teachers really can do, is set that environment of safety to explore and take risks.
Well, the fundamental thing that teachers have to feel, I mean, I think it's a requirement, and it's the basic requirement is teachers have to respect their students.
Right.
And if the teachers respect their students and the teachers respect the differences among their students and between their students and respect the different rates of learning and respect the different where they're coming from and where they're headed, and I mean, then it's just a matter of finding out where that kid is at this particular moment and helping them get to where they want to go and where they're capable of going.
Right.
And it's a matter of respect.
Right. Yeah, I think that, that one of the things that I've noted in sort of my takeaways is when you guys, there is a shift, I think, that's getting there. So in medicine, we're talking about a patient-centered approach. What does the patient really need, as opposed to what does the system need? What do doctors need? And I think you're saying something similar about a student-centered approach. That's part of what we need to do in education, really shift our attention to what do our students really need, um, um,
Well,
and
there's a whole shift. There's a
go
whole
ahead.
shift in thinking of the teacher as the facilitator more than the most knowledgeable person in the room. That the teacher facilitates. There's all this. You work in small groups, and that could be very illuminating for students. But you can also feel like you're going in circles, and you need more direction. So again, it's up to the balance. And I think one of the things that you did, George, in your classroom was that I really got the sense that you enjoyed the argument. You enjoyed
Right.
engaging with us with differing points of view. As 16-year-olds, we were very sure that our interpretation of the Scarlet Letter was the correct one, and you pushed back against that, and it was invigorating to experience those exchanges.
But from the opposite point of view, and what we were talking about earlier about how you do with lifelong learning and all that sort of thing, it was invigorating for me to have all your perspectives conflicting. I mean, if you thought Hester Prynne was X instead of Y, then I had to figure out some way either to accept your vision of her or to convince you that mine was the correct one, and you don't want to get calcified. That's probably what we're saying is that
Right.
lifelong learning, and learning in general is a matter of resisting calcification.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if you engage in it, really, you can establish a new feedback loop that's very very salutary. You know, you mentioned doing puzzles and different things to stimulate your brain. You know, I play words with friends because I love seeing word combinations in Scrabble, but at a certain, it took me a while to master that, but at a certain point I felt like, well, I've gotten to the level that I could achieve. It wasn't stimulating anymore. So I switched to a number puzzle. And when you do that, you almost feel the neurons emerging or making new connections. It's a physical sensation of excitement and nervousness and I can't do this. And then it really feels like a neurological event and it's very stimulating. I just don't know if a lot of people have pay attention to that or how we even talk about it. You know, the calcification is really is a real phenomenon where you just feel like, oh, I can keep doing this forever. But if you do your left hand and you forge those new pathways, and we pay attention to the feedback, the internal feedback, it's very exciting.
Yeah, yeah. Before we close, I want to make sure that I at least talk about something that interested me. So going along just what you just said, Roberta, in terms of, you know, what you've learned, what did you guys learn about doing the book, about yourselves and each other and the process? Because I'm sure, you know, doing it forced you to think about, like, put a lot of things in perspective and make connections and think about things that you hadn't thought about probably in a number of years. So what did you learn in doing the book about, and were there any surprises about things that either one of you learned about yourselves or about education, your thoughts about education?
Well, I'll just jump in first. It was a very vital process. You know, once we figured out how to do it, that we were going to write letters to each other. And we always reacted to, we just fell into a pattern of reacting to what the person said in the previous letter and then carrying it forward, making connections. And it always felt unexpected. You know, I think we shared things that we hadn't that we didn't know about each other in terms of our, even though we were in the classroom together, things that we didn't realize about the other person. I found it a very invigorating process. It was never, I always looked forward to the letters to see what I could grab onto and comment on and advance. It was a really thrilling process for me as someone who had just conceived of myself as the writer who sat alone in my room and thought to myself. It was really quite exciting.
It was definitely illuminating, exciting, and it was interesting to discover that people, and we in particular, could just write letters to each other. I mean, letter writing is disappearing. You know, it's just, I mean, now, granted, what we were writing were emails, not handwritten postal service letters, but they were still, we approached them the same way we would have approached a handwritten letter, and today, you know, I don't know that we could have accomplished this same thing, the same result, if we had been sending text messages, or what are the Snapchats or
right.
whatever. It's, I think, the sustained impulse. One of the things I learned was that it was possible to sustain that kind of thing. I mean, most of my life I've been writing things that last no longer than 20 minutes, and you know, so this was a really marvelous experience.
Yeah.
I think it was also fascinating to experience that shared that time we were together from each other's perspectives, because we were on opposite sides of the desk and there were various expectations that came with that. So it was really interesting to hear you comment on very specific lessons or experience. The time we went to Gatsby's house, I never thought that, for example, that the fact that Ron and I went to find the house would be as gratifying as it was to you. It was just something that Ron and I wanted to do, but to think that it had, to hear you talk about how it made you feel when we came to see you that first day of 12th grade and said, you know, we did it. We took this trip. And I think I even brought the shells I gathered on the trip to show you, as if I had to prove it to you that we were really there. It's that perspective taking. It's that getting out of yourself, seeing things from the other side, the experiencing the other person's perspective.
Yeah.
That's very enlivening.
Yeah.
It wasn't just significant to me. I have told that story to other teachers over the years, high school teachers, middle school teachers, college teachers, and they all react to it with a, "Oh my God, what a wonderful experience!" To have students who actually did that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it was wonderful for me too. And I will, full disclosure, I was surprised to see it in the book. I didn't know I was in the book. But I did, just quickly, some of my takeaways in reading this. One was just this sort of gratification at being able to kind of re-explore, personal history and yourself in a way that wasn't just nostalgia, like, oh yeah, remember Roberta, the time we did that, or remember this, that. It was really a development of like, oh, enriching the past and rethinking and reinterpreting what happened to your life and adding sort of the texture, that enriches your life. And also I felt, it was exciting for me, to read the book. And because as you move forward into the book, um, I could see that it was a sense of discovery too. You were moving forward with these letters, and you were discovering things, chapter by chapter that you hadn't expected, and so it was an interesting journey in that sense, and that to me made it compelling reading, not just okay, this happened, this happened, this happened, but you
Well,
were
that's part of the creative process, because at the beginning, we didn't even know that it was a book. I mean, it was a huge gamble to even say, let's do it. We had no idea. And even when we figured out that we wanted to do it through letters, I didn't have confidence until we were a long way into it that this would actually cohere and become a book. And that open-endedness, I think, is a really great antidote to calcification.
right, right,
That sense of, I'm going somewhere, I trust in it, I have enough control, I have enough confidence to let go of control at the same time. And I don't know where it's going to end up, but I'm going.
there we go.
But and that end, where it's going to end up, not knowing where it's going to end up, is specifically true, because I thought many times during it, I thought, I don't know how we're going to end this thing.
Right.
And Roberta is the one who finally came up with an ending. I
Right.
read that letter and I said, okay, there's the ending.
Right. And unfortunately, George, we've come to the ending of our show, and I regrettably have to end it. But I just wanted to thank you so much, both of you, for this conversation. It was a great trilogy this summer. I look forward to finding ways to continue the project. And I just wanted to, before we close this, are there ways that people can get in touch with you, either one of you, to if they have comments or questions? Any best way to reach you?
I actually have a website,
Okay.
which is george-mcdermott.com.
Right.
So it's possible to get to me there.
And Roberta?
I'm at squirefoundation.org. If you write an email to me, or Israeloff at squirefoundation.org.
Great. Okay, folks. Well, thanks again for listening today. And I'll be back next week, at 12 noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern. I'll be talking with Guido Durley of Emmons Elder Care. And until then, folks, keep moving forward, 45 forward.